Greetings. This is Rabbi Aaron Box from Temple Beth Shalom, back again with my podcast for the week. On February the 14th, Friday night, I will be, for the third or fourth time, be conducting a classical reform Shabbat service here at Temple Beth Shalom. We do it now twice a year, once early or late winter, early spring, and then another time in Thanksgiving. During Thanksgiving, I should say, or around Thanksgiving. And I was asked last week why it was important to still do the classical reform service, even though our regular Friday night service is not classical reform. We use the Reform prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah, but we don't use classical reform prayer books, the UPB. As a matter of fact, the classical reform service that we do is all on PowerPoint because we don't have books. We don't have, I have several copies of the UPB myself, but the congregation doesn't have enough books. And so when I was asked the question of why we still do this service, my answer was it's important for us to remember the history of our movement. That as time has gone on, as we've changed and we've reformed, as we're continuously reforming as a movement, the Torah is a living document. So just like that, our practices somewhat are changing. But it's important to remember our history as well. And as a matter of fact, people who are perhaps my age and older grew up on classical reform services, and the people that are older than me grew up with the Union Prayer Book, which was the original Reform prayer book, classical Reform prayer book, and so it brings back a lot of nostalgia, a lot of feelings of bringing them back to their memories from the past, and it's important to remember our history, to embrace our history. I would not want to do the classical reform service more than 2 or 3 times a year because it is different, and we have adapted and moved forward as a movement. And some of the challenges of the classical reform service are it's not a very modern language. Some of the key components of Judaism, specifically with the liturgy, are back into the fold and more stressed upon now than they did in classical reform. And a perfect example of this is liturgy revolving around Israel. Back when the classical reform movement began, or when the earliest reform movement began here in the United States, Israel was not seen as a place of there was not a need to make aliyah. People believed that here in America we were living in the promised land, and that life was, and this was the feeling. And there were actually a small but very vocal part of the Jewish community, the non-Orthodox Jewish community, and I would actually say probably some within the Orthodox community as well at the time, that actually were against Zionism and were against the idea of resettling in Israel. And it wasn't that they were against Israel, clearly not, but they didn't feel like there was a need. It was okay to have a promised land in the United States of America, and that's the way they felt. Now, obviously, lots of things changed in the 20th century. Specifically between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, and then obviously in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there were a lot of key changes to the liturgy, specifically around Israel, and now the Reform movement encourages people to make Aliyah if they want to, and we take, as a Reform rabbi, I find it a very holy task and responsibility to take people, specifically my congregants and other Jews, to the land of Israel to experience what life is like there. And if any of my congregants wanted to make Aliyah and move to Israel, I would certainly never oppose that, and I would help them do that. 100 years ago or so, I'm not sure that as a rabbi back then I would have. But again, things change. So it's important for us to embrace that part of our history. And I think that when we neglect our history or forget our history or don't embrace our history, it's hard for us to know where we got things wrong, where we got things right. You know, you've I've heard the quote, I'm sure you have too, that we have to learn from our history or else history will repeat itself. Well, some things about our history can be repeated, but if we don't learn from the errors of our past or the mistakes that we've made, and of course I'm not just speaking about Judaism here, I'm speaking more broadly, then we can't move forward. And moving forward is the most important thing we can do. And so I want to just say that Classical Reform Judaism, the Classical Reform service here is very important because, like I said, we need to embrace our past and embrace our history with the point or perspective of looking forward at the same time. And that can be done. And I hope that we can continue to do that, not just in the Jewish community, but also in the greater world out there and everything that we do. And with that, I will bid you a Shabbat Shalom, and I'll be back next week for my next podcast.